Welcome into Jags Now, presented by our wonderful friends over at Prize Picks. On today's show, I'm going to be reacting to Sports Illustrated's John Shipley, who I think does a great job covering the Jacksonville Jaguars. He put out some possible trade candidates that the Jaguars could make during training camp right before the start of the season, and I wanted to react, kind of give my take on it, and I thought he gave some good insight, so we're just going to react on today's show. And if I haven't made this clear enough, I don't think the Jags are going to make a trade before the season starts. I just think that their roster, where they're kind of sits right now, is where it needs to be. I think they have depth in good positions. They don't have really a lot of necessarily weaknesses on this roster. And for the most part, I think unless you see like an obvious upgrade out there or maybe an obvious trade that clearly like you would take in a heartbeat, and you would just send it if you're James Gladstone, I don't really feel like the Jaguars need to necessarily make a trade to improve this roster, but we're just going to kind of go over this possibility on today's show. And we'll start out here with Walker Little, who I know Jaguars fans have talked about it throughout last season and really kind of throughout this entire offseason process. It's like, all right, could the Jaguars look to move off of Walker Little? What's the package that they get for him? And I'm going to discuss why here in a moment. I don't think it's realistic for Jaguars fans to expect Walker Little to get moved at this stage in the offseason. Let's hear from John Shipley on Mr. Little. Starting caliber left tackles are almost never available via trade, and Little would likely generate a strong market. He did have a down year in 2025, and yes, there is a reason a healthy Van Lanen would start over him, but there are quite a few teams who would improve Little on their roster, which makes him a valuable potential chess piece moving forward. And, you know, Little did have a down year in terms of being a starting left tackle, and which is a big reason why Cole Van Lanen got kind of inserted into that starting lineup. Little even played right guard for a couple games there when Patrick McCarry was out towards the end of the season. I think he's not a perfect guy by any means in terms of as a player as at the left tackle spot. You saw the statistics there on your screen, and he graded out as one of the lowest offensive tackles in the National Football League last year. And he has a big cap hit for 2026 at $14.49 million. You don't necessarily love that potentially, not being a starting caliber player for you. That being said, Cole Van Lanen and his situation, he has not participated yet during out Jaguars offseason programs, not at OTAs, not at mandatory minicamp. Liam Coen did say that he expects Van Lanen to return at some point during training camp, may not be ready there for the start, but I'm keeping an eye on this, right? Because Van Lanen is slated to be the Jaguars starting offensive left tackle, as we know at this moment. But if this knee injury continues to linger on, and they've been kind of, we'll see, where he kind of sits at whenever the training camp period starts to get going. If Van Lanen really isn't giving you the full confidence that, week one, he is full strength, ready to go, it kind of would behoove Jacksonville to keep Walker Little on the roster just as a kind of placeholder. That's someone that you can go to knowing that, hey, he's been in that situation before. We can at least trust it from that perspective. So while I don't love necessarily the cap hit that Walker Little currently has at this current moment, I don't necessarily think Jacksonville is going to move on from Mr. Walker Little. Guys, as I just mentioned, the 2026 NFL season is not too far away, and we've got you covered here around the Jacksonville Jaguars here at Jags Now. So if you want to lock us in and make sure you never miss a beat when it comes to the Jacksonville Jaguars, hit that subscribe button. It's youtube.com/Jags News for all the latest around your Jaguars. Getting into trade candidate number 2 now, and it's Christian Braswell, cornerback, who I think there's going to be a role and there's going to be a potential competition to whether or not he makes this team. So could he become a potential trade candidate? We'll discuss here in just a moment. But, guys, we would not be able to do this show if it wasn't for our wonderful friends over at Prize Picks. Today's show is sponsored by Prize Picks, America's #1 sports picks app. The big soccer tournament is here, and all around the office, we've been enjoying it. We've been placing lineups on certain games, and baseball is well underway as well, along with a ton of other sports that you can play and cash in with on Prize Picks. Prize Picks is America's #1 sports picks app, and is the best place to win cash while watching sports. You can choose from numerous stat projections on Prize Picks, including passing yards, rushing yards, touchdowns, points, rebounds, assists, hits, home runs, strikeouts, and a whole lot more. And the app is really easy to use. Just pick more or less on a few player stats and lock in your lineup. And if you're like me, you're kind of more like a football guy, although I do dabble in some other sports from time to time. I've got a 3-pick season-long football stat projection here, $20 to win 120. Personally, I feel really good about Omarion Hampton. I think he's going to hit 1,000 yards this year in Mike McDaniel's offense. I got the more on his rushing yards. BTJ, I'm riding the vibes right now in Jacksonville. Give me the more on his receiving yards. I think he has a bounce-back year. And then Caleb Williams, I think it's a pretty good value. I think there's a good chance he may hit 4,000 passing yards, becoming the first Chicago Bears quarterback to do so. Give me the more on his passing yards. Again, that's a $20 lineup to win 120. New user offer. Download the PrizePicks app today with the link in the comments and the description and use code HMA to get $50 in lineups after you play your first $5 lineup. That's code HMA to get $50 in lineups after you play your first $5 lineup. PrizePicks. It's good to be right. So getting back to Christian Braswell here, I don't necessarily think Braswell will get traded. I think it's a situation of whether he makes the 53-man roster or not, because there are some guys that we'll talk about here in just a moment that could be pushing for Braswell's spot. But I do think, he's got a good shot to, contribute to Anthony Campanelli's defense. But let's hear from John Shipley on Christian Braswell. With the breakout performance this offseason from Jabbar Muhammad and several other young cornerbacks down the depth chart who have stood out, the Jaguars seem to have talent and youth on their side. For Braswell, this would also likely give him a better chance to see the field. And the Jaguars sneakily kind of do have some options that they could turn to at the cornerback position. I do think Travis Hunter, Monteric Brown, Jordan Lewis, and Jarian Jones are pretty much locks to make the roster, if I had to guess currently here today. I do have Christian Braswell along with Dane Jackson kind of fighting for some next snaps there, and depending on how many cornerbacks the Jaguars do keep, that could be somewhere where the line draws. But don't rule out former undrafted free agent Jabbar Muhammad, who's been one of the bright stars in Jaguars offseason program so far, and Liam Coen was singing his praises here recently. I think Jabbar, he's made a ton of plays out there. You could argue for most improved for Jabbar really over the last year. A guy that really spent the majority of the time last year on the practice squad and given show team reps. He's made so many plays out here. I think we're excited about what he's able to do. So when you have somebody like that that's kind of pushing for a roster spot, you kind of look at a guy like Christian Braswell, who in limited snaps last year, 131 total coverage snaps, I don't think performed bad. He only allowed 54.2 completion percentage in coverage, 97 yards, did have a pass breakup, a quarterback rating of 62.2, and grade out solid with a 66.5 coverage grade, and he doesn't cost a lot either, right? $1.14 million. To me, it's like, okay, you have those initial four from the Jaguars that are going to make this cornerback room. Do they keep either Braswell, Dane Jackson, Jabbar Muhammad, one of the three, maybe two of the three? Is Braswell on the inside, the outside looking in? I think we'll get a better feel for that once we get into training camp. I heard some good things from Braswell, not as many as we did hear from Jabbar Muhammad, so he's kind of making his case as to why he should make the roster, but I do think that Braswell is going to be one of those guys where, if a team were to call you and say, hey, we're interested in what he could do, because he does have that outside and nickel flexibility that I think some teams could covet. If a team calls you with an offer for Braswell, I'm not saying the Jaguars would or even should turn it away. I just don't know how likely it is at this stage, but you never know. So Braswell is a potential trade candidate. Keeping it in the secondary now, we've got a starter, Eric Murray, safety, who's going to start presumably alongside Antonio Johnson for this upcoming season. And I think this one, out of all these names that we're going to discuss in this list, he may be the top guy that could potentially get moved realistically, if anybody on this list. Let's hear what Shipley had to say on Mr. Murray. Murray is much more likely to start across from Antonio Johnson in week one than he is to be traded. But that does not mean it would not make some sense for Jacksonville. The Jaguars safety room behind Murray is young, but they have a potential breakout star in Johnson, two recent top 100 picks in Caleb Rensaw and Jalen Husky, and another young safety they like in Rayon Lane. If you look at the Jaguars safety depth chart, I think that if I had to guess right now, I think Murray is going to be the starter alongside Antonio Johnson. But there's a world that either Ransaw or Husky pushes him in training camp to the point where it's like, they kind of have to make a decision here. Who do they like? In which case, I do think Eric Murray could be looked at as expendable. I think Rayon Lane's a really good special teams contributor. I'm not sure how much he would contribute in a starting role, but you never know. I'm not going to rule anything out. Murray's last year, or this past season, I should say, he was productive, 54 tackles, 2 tackles for loss, 6 pass breakups. He did have an interception. Graded out pretty solid as a coverage defender, 60.4, 65.9 in the run defense margin. I think he's somebody that, if I'm looking at this from a Jacksonville perspective, Ransaw, who I think is the most likely, or Husky, if they come into training camp and they are lighting things on fire and they're clearly showing, it has to be a clear and obvious decision to move on from a guy like Eric Murray, who I think, while he may not have the highest upside in terms of a safety and as a talent, I do think that there is a certain level of trust there that Anthony Campanelli can rely with Eric Murray in terms of being in his back seven, in terms of trusting him as a safety in this defense. But if you see a guy that's already building and gaining that trust with potential upside, such as a Ransaw or a Husky, I do think it could be intriguing to play them alongside Antonio Johnson. We'll ultimately see, though, how it turns out in training camp. And the final guy is somebody that we've talked about on the show, and Shipley, I think, has mentioned it from time to time here. And it's Ezra Cleveland, who, in terms of all the guys that got restructured in the offensive line, Ezra Cleveland was not one of those. Could he be a potential trade candidate come training camp? Let's hear what Shipley had to say on the former Minnesota Viking. Cleveland has become a consistent starter for the Jaguars at the left guard spot since then, but his future is now in question considering he is entering a contract year in 2026. The Jaguars have already put big investments into both backup guard positions with the third round selections of Wyatt Milam in 2025 and then Emmanuel Pregnon in 2026, which means the Jaguars could be ready to move on from Cleveland sooner rather than later. And we've talked about it, right? I think it's going to be a legitimate competition at both starting offensive guard spots with Patrick McCarry and Ezra Cleveland. But as I kind of alluded to, both Robert Hainsey and Patrick McCarry had their contracts restructured, meaning it's going to be very hard money-wise to move on from those guys if they were to do so. So I think their place in the roster is pretty locked in. Whether they're starters or not remains to be seen. But when it comes to Ezra Cleveland, you've got a guy in Emmanuel Pregnon who I think could challenge Cleveland's starting position, which I don't necessarily, agree with slash love from a talent perspective because I thought Cleveland at times was one of your better, more consistent offensive linemen for Jacksonville. I mean, you see the numbers on your screen, and we've talked about him before. He does have a higher cap hit this upcoming season at $11.42 million. But if the Jaguars feel that Emmanuel Pregnon and or Wyatt Milam gives them a better chance to win, they're going to play those guys, which could mean that Ezra Cleveland could become expendable in the trade market. And I do think that a starting caliber offensive guard would be something that a lot of teams could be very interested in trying to trade for. Would Jacksonville even want to make him available? I'm not really sure. Would they rather just keep the depth and, just have this ready for the season upcoming ahead? I would like to believe so, but then again, James Gladstone, we've known him to make a lot of serious moves in the past and a lot of, let's just say he's not afraid to kind of throw something out there and see how it sticks. Ezra Cleveland could be a potential trade candidate. But I'm going to ask you guys before we get out of here. I want you to pick one of these guys, if anybody, that could get traded before the start of the 2026 NFL season. If you think it's Walker Little, type 1. If you think it's Christian Braswell, type 2. If you think it's Eric Murray, type 3. If you think it's Ezra Cleveland, type 4. To me, it's a toss-up between 3 or 4, and you could really talk me into either direction. If I had to pick one, I actually might think Eric Murray could be on the way out. But you guys let me know down below in the comment section. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button, turn on your notifications, because we've got you covered with Jacksonville Jaguars content all 365 days out of the calendar year. So lock us in. And until next time, guys, peace.